Ever woke up from a night's sleep before just like any other day? You put the coffee to roast, you wake up the kids to go to school, then you take the dog out for a walk. And as you're putting on the dog's leash and you're going through the front door to go for that walk, you realize you left the door unlocked. All night, you were sleeping like a baby, but your family, your dog, and yourself was exposed to the elements because the door was unlocked. You're under a false sense of security. That's what Americans feel, a false sense of security, when they save a little money. Hi, my name is Adrian, and this is Always Talk Money. I like to talk money as it relates to everyday life. I don't have any investing tips or get rich quick schemes, just a candid conversation amongst friends. And today's conversation is why saving money is actually keeping you poor. Let's get into the video. Okay, so we're going to start with the obvious. I know a lot of people are going to think that's where I'm going with this video. When you save money in the bank, you lose money to inflation. So technically, it's making you poorer. And even in today's times, it's actually much worse because inflation is close to double digits, when usually annually the Fed aims for 2% worth of inflation. But that's not the main point why I'm going to say saving you money is making you poorer. Yes, that's a part of it, but to me that's low-hanging fruit. And if you know me and if you've watched a couple of my videos up to this point, I appreciate you. Hit a like, subscribe. But if you have, you know I like to dig a little bit deeper under the surface when I try to make my points. Now, if you've ever watched any video on personal finance, they tell you to save 6 months worth of expenses. That's kind of like the industry standard, or a year if you know you're feeling fancy. But 6 months seems to be the rhetoric that everyone kind of goes around. But who came up with that number, and why is it one size fits all? Why is it 6 months? Of course, it's a blanket number that everyone should be safe at, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. That's fine. On the surface, to me, that's fine. But hear me out. Think of the last 3 years of your life. You know, financially, personally, emotionally, career-wise, whatever. When was the last time you had an emergency that tantamounted to 6 months worth of expenses? When was the last time you had an expense that was 3 months worth of expenses? When was the last time you had an emergency that was 1 month's worth of expenses? I want you guys to dissect that for a minute, because where I'm going with this is something that I've never heard anyone speak of, but it's something that I have practiced personally in my own situation. And you know I like to say personal finance is just that. It's personal. And so when you have 6 months, that's a one size fits all. I like to go back to my last 3 years of expenses and kind of go back and do an analysis of all my emergencies, all of the times that I needed some quick money to deal with something that came up unexpectedly, aka an emergency. And what I found was within the last 3 years, 36 months, whatever, I generally don't have an emergency that comes close to 6 months worth of expenses. Matter of fact, I genuinely don't have an emergency that comes close to 3 months worth of an expenses. And so I thought about it and I went back even further to 10 years. And in the last 10 years, I have not had an emergency that costs more than $4,000 at a single point in time. And that's just for me. And as I said, personal finance is just personal. And I'm not telling you to have $4,000 as your number. That's just for me. And so what I'm actually saying is, why don't you go back and take an account of your expenses for the last 3 years and see where the emergencies are, see where the spikes are where you needed that emergency fund. How much was it? And do an average over the last 3 years. The reason why I say 3 years is if you go back too far, the experiment doesn't really work, because in 3 years, not much is going to change in your life, but in 10 years, a lot might change, because in 10 years, your expenses might have been one number, but 10 years later, you might have had kids, you might have bought a house, and so on and so forth. So in 3 years, you need a much more tighter period of time where you get a much more accurate number. And the reason why I say that is if in the last 3 years you have not had an emergency that was over $3,000, then let me ask you a question. Do you think in the future you're more than likely to have an expense that stays around $3,000, or something that you need 6 months worth of an emergency? Because a 6-month emergency fund basically is like your world is ending, right? But why is that making you poorer, as the topic of the video is? Because when you oversave, there's an opportunity cost. As I said, obviously you lose your money through inflation in the bank and so on and so forth, but there's an opportunity cost, because for every dollar over your average emergency cost that you save, that's an opportunity cost for money that you could invest in yourself, money that you could invest in an asset, or acquiring like property or anything else that could bring you more money that you could invest in a business. And so in essence, you're creating a false sense of security for yourself, because you are tantamount to having 6 months worth of expenses or even a year's worth of expenses. You are basically a doomsday prepper. And sure, doomsday might come, but those guys, or those people who are doomsday preppers, they're building bunkers and they're getting thousands and pounds of non-perishable food, and they're just preparing for the worst, not living life, not coming outside, just living in a constant state of paranoia. And we're all out here living life, taking vacations, falling in love, going to the beach, building families and so on and so forth. And they're just over there just saying, you wait, one day, just one day it's going to happen. One day it's going to happen, and that one day is not going to come. And then so they waste their whole lives not actually living life because they're waiting on this one doomsday. If your emergency fund is only going to be triggered by the one time or the one minuscule opportunity for you to have 6 months worth of expenses, then what are you really doing? You're just creating a false sense of security for yourself. Because you know what's real security? Real security is actually having money and having assets. Elon Musk doesn't worry about how much emergency funds he has. Jeff Bezos doesn't, or any other millionaire. During COVID, you know what the millionaires were doing? They were going to their second and third and fourth vacation homes in the Hamptons or somewhere in the Caribbean to get away from everything. The Kardashians were flying out their entire family to a vacation during COVID. Because why? It's not because they had 6 months worth of expenses. It's because they had money. And so when you hoard your money and not use it to make money for you, instead of sitting in the bank, then you are doing yourself a disservice. You are making yourself poorer. In my personal opinion, if I make less than $50,000 a year, I do not have any business saving or investing. The only thing I would be concentrating on is doubling, tripling, quadrupling my income. You want to make sure you're securing your future for 6 months, 6 years, 60 years, for generations to come. Most people will realize that their emergencies are few and far between, and when they do come, they're probably not as much as you think. Is that to say you shouldn't save? Of course, and if you have 6 months, that's great. But usually the people who have 6 months worth of expenses are the people who have the resources to do so. And so when you're trying to compete on the playing field of people who have mega wealth, or at least high incomes, then you are failing. Spend time trying to increase your income, and don't spend time trying to hope and pray that you just have enough just to get by. Just to get by is not going to cut it. In times of inflation, in times of economic uncertainty, just to get by is not going to do it. And so when I talk about at the beginning of the video, you having 6 months worth of expenses when your income is super low, that's tantamount to you going to bed and not locking your door. You have a false sense of security, because the real threat is you do not make enough money. Thanks for watching.